a strategic operation that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in mere hours. Hours that shattered Russian assumptions about Ukrainian capabilities, hours that forced the Kremlin into emergency security consultations, hours that fundamentally changed the calculus of this entire conflict. What President Volodymyr Zelensky did today crossed a line that Vladimir Putin had hoped would hold indefinitely, and when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with precision, boldness, and devastating effectiveness. This was not improvisation. This was not desperation. This was calculated strategic brilliance executed at exactly the right moment. And tonight, for the first time in months, it is Moscow that finds itself scrambling to respond. For weeks now, there had been signals, not official announcements, not formal military communications, just signals, that Zelensky was preparing something unprecedented. Ukraine has been resilient, yes, but they have been methodical in their resilience. Their operations have followed a certain pattern, a rhythm, almost a predictability that allowed analysts on both sides to anticipate their next moves. But what set off alarm bells in Moscow this week was that the pattern went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Ukrainian military communications and troop movements know the indicators: the sudden repositioning of specialized units, the quiet accumulation of long-range strike capabilities, the unusual diplomatic activity with Western partners, the sudden decrease in public statements about operational objectives. All of that went quiet. And whenever Zelensky goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. The Ukrainian president has built a reputation over 34 months of war as a leader who understands the power of timing. He knows when to speak, he knows when to act, and most importantly, he knows when to let his military do the talking. Russian military commanders had grown accustomed to Ukrainian patterns. They had developed countermeasures. They had positioned forces accordingly. But what they failed to understand was that Zelensky had been studying them just as carefully. He had been watching their responses. He had been noting their vulnerabilities, and he had been waiting for exactly the right moment to exploit them. Early Thursday morning, satellite imagery analysts detected what they described as unprecedented Ukrainian military activity, including the movement of advanced strike systems that had not been deployed in active operations in over 6 months. These are the kinds of assets that Ukraine only uses when they are signaling something very specific: a major offensive push, a strategic retaliation, or a complete paradigm shift in their operational approach. Western observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Zelensky was changing Ukraine's strategic posture. And when a nation at war shifts its strategic posture without explanation, even by small measures, every major power pays attention. The first indication that something significant was underway came from Russian military bloggers, typically reliable sources of frontline information, who began reporting unusual activity along multiple sectors simultaneously. This was not a localized operation. This was not a probing attack. This was something coordinated on a scale that caught even seasoned analysts off guard. Within hours, reports began flooding in from multiple sources confirming what intelligence agencies had feared. Ukraine had launched its most ambitious coordinated strike operation since the early days of the Kyiv counter-offensive. But this time, the targets were different. This time, Zelensky was sending a message that Moscow could not ignore. The statement issued by Russian military leadership tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Source after source described Zelensky's move as unexpected, strategically significant, and perhaps most importantly, embarrassingly effective. Moscow had believed that their defensive preparations were sufficient to blunt any Ukrainian strategic initiative. But strategic preparation only works if the adversary attacks where you expect them to. Zelensky did not. In fact, Ukraine's response today was among the most sophisticated we've seen in the entire conflict. Here's what we know. Within 4 hours of the initial strike authorization, Ukrainian forces launched coordinated operations across 7 different regions simultaneously. These weren't the standard drone attacks that Russian air defense systems had grown accustomed to intercepting. These were precision-guided munitions, advanced systems that Ukraine only deploys when they're preparing to achieve decisive strategic effects. The coordination was remarkable, the timing was impeccable, and the results were devastating for Russian military infrastructure. Reports indicate that Ukrainian forces struck critical logistics nodes, command and control facilities, and ammunition depots that Russian forces had believed were beyond Ukraine's operational reach. Tonight, multiple intelligence sources confirmed that Ukraine launched precision strikes on Russian military targets, including a major logistics hub that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was a planned Russian offensive operation. Ukraine struck before Russia could execute their planned operations. They hit fuel depots that supplied frontline units. They hit communication relays that coordinated defensive positions. They hit ammunition storage facilities that were likely preparing to support offensive operations. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's military operations in the region, the infrastructure that would have made their planned offensive possible. This is what made Western analysts' assessments so significant. Zelensky's operation wasn't just symbolic, it was operationally decisive. It represented the kind of coordinated strike that could fundamentally degrade Russian military capabilities if sustained over time. And Ukraine, understanding that, fully executed with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't waste assets on low-value targets. They didn't disperse their efforts across meaningless objectives. They hit command infrastructure. They hit logistics networks. They hit the systems that Russia needs to sustain offensive operations. Military analysts are already describing this as one of the most effective coordinated strike operations of the entire war. The level of intelligence, planning, and execution required to pull off simultaneous strikes across such a wide area suggests that Ukraine has reached a new level of operational sophistication, and that should worry Moscow more than any single tactical victory ever could. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence agencies now believe that Russia's recent military posturing was designed to test the resolve of Ukraine and its Western partners after months of political uncertainty in Washington. Moscow wanted to see whether Kyiv would flinch under renewed pressure, but instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't hesitate. They launched a response that was so swift, so comprehensive that even Russian military commanders appeared caught off guard. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily, but today Zelensky did. Defense analysts speaking with international media under anonymity described Moscow's reaction as visible confusion, a departure from the typically measured responses we see from Russian military leadership. Putin's government had believed that sustained pressure would eventually cause Ukrainian resolve to crack. But Zelensky proved today that Ukraine remains both capable and determined. Their strikes were not only precise, they were timed so effectively that Russian air defense systems failed to intercept a significant portion of incoming munitions. That timing matters because it shows that Ukraine has developed sophisticated intelligence capabilities regarding Russian defensive postures. It shows that Zelensky is not simply reacting to Russian moves, he is anticipating them, he is staying one step ahead, and that represents a fundamental shift in the dynamics of this conflict. For months, the narrative had been about Ukrainian defense, about holding the line, about preventing Russian advances, about survival. But tonight, the narrative changed. Tonight, Ukraine demonstrated that it retains the capability to conduct offensive operations that can genuinely threaten Russian military objectives. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian long-range strike units carried out attacks on at least 12 separate targets, forcing Russian forces to divert air defense assets from frontline positions. Special operations units targeted communication infrastructure that had been reinforced in the last 72 hours. Ukrainian naval drones operating in the Black Sea reportedly struck Russian naval assets used by Moscow to launch cruise missile attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. This wasn't just a tactical operation. This wasn't just a retaliatory strike. This was strategic coordination. This was operational initiative. And operational initiative is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the failure of their initial invasion objectives. For every advance they have made on the ground, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates their strategic position. Every Russian gain has come at a cost that Moscow did not anticipate. Every territorial advance has stretched supply lines and exposed vulnerabilities. And tonight, Zelensky demonstrated that Ukraine knows exactly where those vulnerabilities are. The message was clear. Russia can continue grinding forward on the ground, but Ukraine retains the capability to make every inch of that advance extraordinarily costly. Remember, Putin thought Ukraine would collapse within days of the initial invasion. He thought Zelensky would flee Kyiv and seek asylum in the West. He thought Western support would be symbolic and short-lived. He thought Russian military superiority would overwhelm Ukrainian resistance. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is launching sophisticated, coordinated operations against Russian military infrastructure. Western support continues to flow despite political uncertainty. Zelensky remains in Kyiv, defiant and determined, and Russian military commanders are scrambling to explain how their defenses failed so comprehensively. The assumptions that underpinned Russia's entire strategic approach have proven catastrophically wrong, and tonight's events represent yet another data point demonstrating that Moscow fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the conflict they initiated. This was never going to be a quick victory. This was never going to be easy. And as tonight's events demonstrate, this is far from over. What makes this moment so significant and so dangerous is that Zelensky's bold move happened at a time when Putin is under extraordinary pressure from multiple directions. Russian military hardliners want more aggressive action and faster results. Russian economic elites want sanctions relief and a return to normalcy. Russian nationalists want territorial expansion at any cost. Russian pragmatists want a negotiated settlement that preserves gains. Putin is balancing these competing demands while managing a military campaign that has exceeded all projected timelines and costs. And when leaders in that position face sudden reversals, they rarely respond with measured restraint. They respond with escalation. They respond with aggression. They respond in ways designed to reassert dominance and project strength. That is what makes the coming days so critical. Zelensky's move was bold, it was effective, it was strategically sound, but it also raises the stakes in a conflict that was already extraordinarily dangerous. The intelligence assessment now circulating among Western allies was designed to signal that NATO is not willing to allow Ukraine to face escalation alone. Officials said plainly that Russia's potential response options were inconsistent with international norms and established red lines. That is diplomatic language for we're watching and there will be consequences. You don't usually hear that tone from Western intelligence agencies unless something serious is at stake. The coordination between Kyiv and its Western partners appears to have been extensive in the lead-up to this operation. This was not Ukraine acting alone. This was Ukraine acting with full awareness of the support infrastructure behind them. And that support infrastructure sent its own message tonight. We stand with Ukraine. We support their right to defend themselves, and we will not be intimidated by Russian threats. Meanwhile, President Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people in a calm, resolute speech tonight. He said Ukraine will never accept dictated terms from an aggressor who has brought nothing but suffering to our people. He said our forces have demonstrated today that we retain the capability to defend our homeland and to strike those who would destroy it. And he said the world should understand that Ukraine fights not only for itself, but for the principles that underpin international order. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky's words were measured, his tone was confident, and his message was unmistakable. Ukraine will continue fighting, Ukraine will continue striking, and Ukraine will not be broken by Russian aggression. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Zelensky's bold move wasn't isolated. Along with the primary strike operations, Ukrainian cyber units also launched coordinated attacks on Russian communications infrastructure. Ukrainian intelligence services released intercepted communications revealing Russian military planning. Ukrainian diplomatic efforts increased pressure on neutral countries still trading with Russia. All of this happened within the same 48-hour period. When Ukraine moves multiple pieces at once, it means something large is underway. This was not a single operation. This was a coordinated campaign across multiple domains. Military, cyber, intelligence, diplomatic, all working in concert toward a unified strategic objective. That level of coordination suggests planning that began weeks or even months ago. It suggests that Zelensky has been preparing this moment carefully, and it suggests that we may be seeing the beginning of a new phase in this conflict. Western analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Ukraine is preparing for a major offensive operation, and tonight's strikes were designed to shape the battlefield. Another is that Zelensky is attempting to demonstrate Ukrainian capabilities before potential negotiations to strengthen his bargaining position. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Ukraine is attempting to fundamentally alter the strategic equation before political changes in Western capitals affect their support. But today, Zelensky took the initiative in a way that few expected. He didn't wait for Russian operations to unfold. He didn't respond reactively to Moscow's moves. He didn't allow uncertainty to paralyze Ukrainian action. He struck first, he struck hard, and he demonstrated that Ukraine remains a formidable fighting force, capable of surprising even the most prepared adversary. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Putin wants to see whether Western support will waver under pressure. Zelensky wants to show that Ukraine can fight and win, regardless of political uncertainties. NATO wants to prevent escalation beyond Ukraine's borders, and the international community wants to prevent this conflict from spiraling into something even more catastrophic. Each of these actors is watching the others carefully. Each is calibrating their responses based on what they observe, and each understands that the decisions made in the coming days could shape the trajectory of this conflict for months or years to come. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence sources who are now monitoring Russian military communications for signs of response planning. They say Russian commanders are still assessing the full extent of the damage from Ukrainian strikes. They say Moscow's initial reaction has been characterized by confusion and finger-pointing over defensive failures. And they say Zelensky's decision to launch such a comprehensive operation is likely part of a broader strategy intended to maintain strategic initiative despite resource constraints. But Russia is not retreating. In fact, Russian military leadership is reportedly planning retaliatory operations. Their response, whenever it comes, will likely be forceful, visible, and designed to reassert Russian dominance. Ukraine's response today, swift, precise, and comprehensive, sent a message to Moscow that Ukrainian resolve remains unbroken. And it sent a message to Western allies that their support is being used effectively and strategically. As the situation continues to develop, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Zelensky hoped to achieve with this operation. But what we do know is that Ukraine's action was timely. It disrupted Russian operational planning, it demonstrated Ukrainian capabilities to skeptical observers, and it shifted the narrative from Ukrainian defense to Ukrainian initiative. What happens next will depend on what Moscow does in the next 72 hours. If they respond with measured restraint, this moment will be remembered as a turning point in Ukrainian strategic confidence. If they escalate significantly, Ukraine and its Western partners have already shown they are prepared for that contingency. They have shown they are ready to respond. They have shown they will not be intimidated. And they have shown that underestimating Ukrainian resolve is a mistake that Russia continues to make at its own peril. And tonight, for the first time in months, Moscow appears to be genuinely uncertain about what comes next. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is calculating, it means he is weighing his options carefully, it means he is considering responses that range from the measured to the catastrophic. Because tonight, Moscow learned something they have been forced to learn many times since February 2022. Ukraine will not surrender, Ukraine will not break, and Ukraine, under Zelensky's leadership, will continue to fight with everything they have. This story is far from over, but tonight, one thing is clear. Zelensky's bold move has changed the strategic conversation. Moscow's assumptions have been shattered once again, and the world is watching to see what happens next. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.